Hey guys, thanks for coming back. Join us here at Salty Ginger Talk. Glad to have you back. So today's episode, we're going to talk about taxes, U.S. government revenue sources. Um, being a business person and economics major, it's a topic that I've spent a lot of time on. So we're just going to buzz through kind of current state, a little bit of history on how we got to where we're at, and then kind of current state on revenues and their percent of GDP and where it comes from and all that stuff. And then on future episodes, we can dig into some potential solutions. It's not as complicated as we've allowed it to become, and that's largely, in my opinion, largely due to lobbyists and special interests and a lot of the money that's in politics. I don't know a good solution because, like, you should be able to advocate for your position, but um, we'll dig into it in further episodes. There are just so many carve outs and special interest groups that make our economy work so much less efficiently than it should. And I think that absolutely hampers the government's ability to finance its activities, and the government's involved in a ton of stuff it just shouldn't be involved in my opinion. So, with that said, we're going to talk about taxes and revenue sources, and kind of get a lay of the land and level set on some basic facts. So, where does the government get money from? So, I hear a lot the government created this many jobs and this and that. The government does nothing. And I cannot stress that enough. Nothing. The government is not responsible for a single job. It's not responsible for a single bit of economic growth other than setting policies which are conducive to businesses and entrepreneurs taking risks and creating jobs and businesses and value. The only way the government makes any money is by confiscating it from the private sector and putting it into the public sector. So it's a net sum zero win for the economy. That's just a statement of fact. There's no other way for it to happen. The government can't create any value, it only confiscates money from others. So let's start there. So the revenue that comes in to the government, and some of that's necessary, right? There's some things in the Constitution, provide for the common defense. We have to have a military. We have to have certain things that cost money. Totally got it. I think that's expanded well beyond where it's necessary. Now, I'm not saying people don't need help. I'm saying that the government is an extremely inefficient delivery mechanism for that help. I think the country used to work a lot better when things were pushed down locally and done through volunteer organizations, churches, neighborhood groups, all those types of entities. And, there's pretty famous uh, social scientist Alexis de Tocqueville that wanted to understand why America was being so successful. This was back in the 1800s. And he came and kind of did an assessment of what he saw and said it's really those organizations, those grassroots organizations that at the ground level really kind of help where it's necessary and kind of push people where it's necessary. Because that's the biggest problem, the way I see it, is the government programs are one size fits all, and so many people can take advantage of those programs, or the spending is so wasteful. The administrators don't pay attention. People inject their own personal values and beliefs into those programs, and it's just not an efficient way to allocate resources. So, from an economics background, I'm just dead set against government intervention in most cases. So, some of it's necessary, a lot of it's not. Where does the money come from? That's what we're talking about today. So, in the fiscal year 2022, the federal government took in $4.9 trillion in revenue. That's 19.6% of GDP that year. So, another way to say it is 20% of the goods and services that the country produced were given to the federal government to fund their activities. It's pretty wild that 1/5 of the total goods and services we produced in that year went to the federal government. And we'll talk about it later, but it's been pretty consistent. The average is like 17.4 over the last 50 years. And that's pretty consistent regardless of the tax structure, regardless of how things are set up. There's a lot of proof that says somewhere around that 17, 18% is what we're going to collect. So why not make it a lot easier than it is now, and just do a flat tax on everybody and simplify things. Yeah, we'll get to that later. But um, 2022, 4.9 trillion in revenue, 19.6% of GDP. What is the breakdown of that revenue? How much of it came from which source? So 54% of that came from individual income taxes. That's the single largest source since 1944, has always been individual income taxes. It averages around 10% of GDP. So the money we all make, 10% of it goes back to the government since 1944 on average. Um, that's crazy to me. 10% of GDP of all the goods and services we produce, 10% goes back to the government. 9% of that came from corporate taxes. Now that's fallen from an average of 3.7% of GDP in the late 1960s to an average of about 1.5% of GDP in the last 10 years. Now, there's some reasons for some of that. Um, some of it is lobbying, some of it is preferential treatment for particular industries. I would argue the farming industry gets a lot of potential or preferential treatment. Oil and gas, the medical, the insurance industries all get preferential treatment. But there was also a change in the tax code in the late 70s to create LLCs. And so it used to be that if you were a business, you were an S Corp or a C Corp, and there was no LLC. So that meant all of those, the revenue and the taxes from that revenue was paid through the business. When the LLC was created, it pushed those revenues in most instances to individual income tax returns. And so that has absolutely impacted the percentage of funding that comes from businesses versus the percentage of funding that comes from individuals. Because the LLC is created, those gains and losses are passed through to individual returns, and they're going to be reported on in the IRS on individual returns. So there's always some factors. You always got to dig a little deeper and try to understand why things are the way they are, and that's certainly both special interest in lobbying and the LLC Act or creation of LLCs impacted that. 30% of that revenue comes from the Social Security tax, the payroll taxes. So 30% of the 4.9 trillion, think about that. So $5 trillion, 30% of that 5 trillion goes to Social Security. It's wild how that program has grown. And, we'll do an episode on Social Security, how it came into existence and kind of the way it was designed and why it's such a challenge now. But current state, about 30% of the total revenue that the U.S. government gets comes from the Social Security tax through payroll. 2% is excise taxes. That's taxes on goods and services, mostly gasoline, cigarettes, alcohol, and airline travel. A lot of that's what we call a sin tax. Like if you're going to have bad behavior, we're going to tax you for it. You could argue whether that's good or bad, but it is. That's how it happens. And then 5% comes from other sources. And those other sources are things like the estate tax, the gift tax, customs. And that number is actually really high now compared to how it was the previous 40 years. Last 10 years, it's been high with the quantitative easing program that's been in place because the gains, and I say gains in quotes because when you create the money, create the bonds, and then buy those bonds back, you're not really creating anything. Again, government can't create anything, but the revenue and the income that comes from those activities shows in this line. So it's that 5% is the other. So with the income tax being the vast majority of it, 54% of the total revenue for the country, why is there an income tax? When is it? Where did it come from? Because there's not always been an income tax. We founded the nation in 1776 when we declared independence from Britain, and there wasn't an income tax until 1861. So it was almost 100 years later that the first income tax came in. And in 1861, what was going on? The Civil War. Had to pay for the Civil War. So there was an income tax created. It was a flat 3% tax on incomes over $800. And that was later modified to include a graduated progressive tax. And we have a progressive tax system, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But So that tax was in place to fund the Civil War, and it was repealed in 1872 after the Civil War was over and it had been paid down. All the expenses that had been incurred during the Civil War had been paid down. So, um, never wanting to miss a good opportunity, Congress over the next several decades kept talking about an income tax. And so there were several attempts to institute an income tax during that period. So in 1894, Congress they passed a law that enacted a 2% tax on income over $4,000, which was almost immediately struck down by a 5-4 Supreme Court decision saying it was unconstitutional, that nowhere in the Constitution did Congress have the right to institute an income tax, which was interesting. So you say, okay, if there's no income tax, how did the United States pay for things before there was an income tax? Well, most of that income came from tariffs and excise taxes on liquor, wine, beer, and tobacco. So there was enough revenue generated from those activities to fund the government. And it was largely because the government was very small, intentionally, I might add, as was envisioned by the founding fathers. So there wasn't a strong kind of overarching federal government the way it exists now. And there was not a need for a bunch of revenue. And the revenue that was created from tariffs and excise taxes covered the nut. So there wasn't a lot to worry about. After the Civil War, um, Reconstruction happened, the Industrial Revolution happened, and there was still a lot of folks that were farmers, especially in the South, right? The tobacco farming was still going on. You think about the way the South operated, and slavery was outlawed, and so their costs went up, rightfully, I might add. And they didn't have a lot of pricing power because the Industrial Revolution was driving the economy, and the textiles and the products that were being created through the Industrial Revolution. This is when oil was introduced, and heating oil and kerosene. Vanderbilt built the railroads during these periods. So there was a bunch of big businesses that were driving the economy, and the farmers didn't have a lot of pricing power. And so they were looking for Congress to help them kind of level the playing field. Again, special interests, with instead of letting the economy dictate, the invisible hand of the economy dictate how scarce resources should be allocated. There were several attempts to try to attach an income tax to a tariff bill or other bill. Um, they were weak attempts, and because the economy was doing so well in that period, they really never gained much traction. With that said, the Democrat Party and the progressives in the Democrat Party kind of kept the idea alive. They always had an income tax as a plank in their platform, and they kept trying to revive it without much success. Fast forward to 1909, when Congress once again tried to attach an income tax bill or an income tax to a tariff bill. And the conservatives said, hey, look, we're tired of this. We don't want to keep having this conversation. Instead of making this part of a bill, why don't we suggest you make it an amendment to the Constitution? Thinking that because any amendment to the Constitution required not only congressional approval, but ratification by 3/4 of the states, they thought, hey, there's no way the 3/4 of the states would approve an income tax. And so they said, yeah, go ahead. Like, instead of doing it as a law, let's do it as an amendment. To their surprise, state after state after state ratified this amendment. And so it kind of backfired on them when they went down this road. And in 1913, the Revenue Act became the 16th Amendment and created the income tax that we know today. At least it was the first version of the income tax we know today. Now, when you think about today's tax rates, which we'll cover in a little bit, this income tax was very modest. It was a 1% tax on incomes above $3,000, and it went up to a top rate of 6% on those earning more than $500,000 a year. With that said, there were so many carve outs and ways to minimize your tax obligation that almost nobody paid the income tax when it first started out. And so it's gone through tons of permutations over the years and has been expanded. And in fact, the income tax, the way it was defined in that first act, really described the way capital gains taxes are now, not income you get from your job, but if you own a stock or you sell an asset and that asset had gains over time, those are capital gains. And that's really what the original income tax was meant to target. But like any government program, the minute it gets instituted, it starts expanding, becomes pervasive, and turns into the monster that we know of today. So, what is the income tax today? The current brackets range from a 10% tax on the first $10,000 that you make and goes up from there, with the top income tax being 35% on, I think it's somewhere around $500,000 now, on 35%. And it's important to understand how the progressive tax works. Because let's say you were taxed, let's say you make $750,000. You don't pay 35% on all $750,000 of taxable income. You pay 10% on the first $10,000. And then, sorry, I had that number. It's 37% on anything above $578,126. So my mistake there. But that's the top bracket. So on any dollar above, so on dollar 578,127, that gets taxed at 37%. The first 10,000 gets taxed at 10%. Then the next batch is 12%, and that goes from 10,001 to 44,725. Now from there it jumps to 22%, so it almost doubles at 44,725. So at dollar 44,726 of taxable income, you pay 22% rate on that all the way up to 95,375. And then there's brackets from there that go, so it's 10%, then 12%, then 22%, then 24%, then 32, then 35, all the way up to 37. So that's why our income tax is progressive, because you pay progressively more tax on each dollar that you make that kicks you into a different bracket. So that's how the income tax works today. It's evolved a ton since it was first introduced in 1913. And I would argue that it's become obtrusive, that it's become unwieldy, that it's allowed the government to expand into areas the government has no business being involved in. And we waste, and we not waste, we steal money from our citizens to fund these programs that most people don't want, that most people don't know about. There's rampant waste and lack of accountability in government programs. And it's something we'll talk about as an economics major and a business person. I feel very strongly. Most people are willing to pay some version of a tax. They just want to know that it's being used for good purposes and that it's not being squandered. And I don't think either of those questions can be answered affirmatively in most instances. So that's where I think most people have problems with it. And again, when you look at the last 50 years, we average about 17.4% of GDP in terms of revenue that the government collects. Why do we make it as complicated as it is right now? Why do we have all these additional taxes when you think about all the taxes that you pay on dollars that you receive from a company that's already paid tax? It's paid a payroll tax. It's paid the SSI tax. It's crazy how much a dollar is taxed, well above 50% when you add up all the national, state, local, and excise taxes that we pay. Your tax rate's well above 50%. If you ever sit down and do the math, it'll make you sick. So we'll do an episode on that and just do an example of how much the actual tax rate is on an average American citizen, because it's wild. So anyhow, hope you found that useful. Kind of a deep dive into how we got to where we're at on the income tax. Sets up a lot of additional conversations. Love to hear your take on how things work and how you feel about income taxes and the way things are set up now, and your ideas on how they could be set up better. I have my own personal views and opinions, but I'd love to hear what you guys have to say as well. So don't forget to go over to our website, saltygingertalk.com. You can check out all of our podcast episodes there. We've got links to all of our social media and all of our content. over there, and you can sign up for our newsletter over there. So thanks for coming back and seeing us here at Salty Ginger Talk, guys. Really appreciate the support. Look forward to seeing you next time, and have a great week.